All right, everyone, welcome back to the deep dive. If you love uncovering the hidden stories behind how things are made and how the world works well, hit that like button and subscribe because you won't want to miss what we have coming up. Today, we're going deep into a world that is super crucial, but often overlooked. We're talking about the work that happens way before the exciting part of design in any building project.
Yeah,
Yeah, we're diving into the world of pre-designed services.
definitely exciting stuff. You can really think of it as the strategy and planning phase where we figure out the big picture.
And we've got some seriously detailed information to work through today. So much groundwork goes on to ensure a project is successful, but is all behind the scenes.
Yeah, exactly. Everyone gets excited about the visuals and the final design, but this initial phase is where those make or break decisions happen. This is where the foundation for the whole project is laid.
Okay, I'm intrigued. When we talk about pre-design, what are we actually talking about? It sounds like it could be anything before pen hits paper on the design.
Well, it's all about helping the client define what they need. It's about figuring out where the project might actually go and if it's even doable, practically and financially. That means we're creating a detailed, functional program and figuring out the overall scope of the project.
So it's kind of like problem solving before you even start thinking about solutions.
Exactly. It's like laying the foundation for the foundation.
I like that.
And just so we're all on the same page, there are a few key definitions that are super important here. The first one is the business case.
Okay.
The business case,
Okay.
right. The business case is all about why this project needs to happen. What's the justification? What are the benefits? Then you've got the feasibility study.
The feasibility study.
Yep. The feasibility study takes a bigger picture look at the project. It asks, is this project actually viable? Is it practical? And it looks at the economics, the regulations, how the project will operate, all of those aspects. And then, of course, you have the functional program.
And the functional program.
This one's a biggie. It's basically a detailed written description that lays out all the needs and requirements of the project. And finally, there's the gap analysis.
Okay, a gap analysis.
Right. A gap analysis is all about helping the client see the difference between where they are now and where they want to be in the future. And all of these things fall under the umbrella of pre-design services.
Okay, I'm starting to get the picture, but why is all this upfront work so important? It sounds like it could add a ton of time to the start of a project.
It's absolutely vital. It's all about setting the project up for success. Pre-design gives both the client and the architect the information they need to make really smart design decisions later on. During this phase, the client is making some huge choices.
Yeah, like what?
We're talking about things like picking the site for the project, figuring out how to use existing buildings, if there are any, establishing how the project team will be structured, and even deciding the best way to get the resources they'll need.
So these are big decisions happening before any design work has even begun.
Absolutely. And, clients come to the table with different levels of preparedness. Some have been doing tons of planning and have a super clear vision. Others need a bit more guidance on why this pre-design stage is worth the investment.
Right.
And this brings us to a really cool concept called the McLeamy curve.
The McLeamy curve. I've never heard of that.
It's super insightful. Basically, the McLeamy curve shows that you have the most power to influence a project's outcome in those early pre-design stages. That's when you have the most control over quality costs and the schedule.
Oh, interesting.
And what's even more interesting is that it's also the cheapest time to make changes. So if you invest in making smart decisions early on, you seriously reduce the risk of running into problems or blowing your budget later.
So a little bit of upfront planning can save a lot of headaches and money down the line.
100%. And while pre-design might not fall under what we traditionally call basic architectural services, it's completely essential to a successful project.
Yeah.
In fact, for really complex projects, pre-design can take years to complete properly. But when a project has that strong pre-design foundation, it's way more likely to finish on time, on budget, and actually meet or even exceed the client's expectations.
Years, huh? That's really impressive. So what kinds of activities or services are we actually talking about when we say pre-design? It seems like a pretty broad category.
It definitely is. You've got the business cases and feasibility studies that we already talked about, of course.
Right.
Then there's project budgeting and cost planning.
Okay.
You've got life cycle cost studies, which look at the long-term costs of running and maintaining the building, not just the upfront construction costs. Functional programming is key. That's all about defining the space needs and how different areas will work together. We've got space planning and optimization to make sure the space is used efficiently. And even organizational and business planning comes into play because you need to make sure the physical space actually supports how the client operates.
That's already a pretty expensive list.
Oh, And there's more.
Even more.
Absolutely. You also have site evaluation and selection, master planning and urban design come in, and we can break down the difference between those two a bit later.
Sounds good.
Building condition assessments are really important when you're working with existing buildings.
Right.
And creating as-found drawings to accurately document those existing buildings is a key part of pre-design as well. Then there's establishing a project management framework, coordinating any data that the client provides, developing those high-level project schedules, consulting with the AHJs, those authorities having jurisdiction to make sure you're meeting all the regulations.
Wow.
And the list goes on. There's land use analysis and potentially helping with rezoning efforts, doing a preliminary building code and fire safety analysis, preparing presentations and promotional materials for the project, and even engaging with the public to get their input and documenting all the requirements if there's going to be a design competition or a call for proposals. It's pretty amazing.
That's a whole lot more involved than just sketching out some design ideas.
Yeah.
Totally. It's about digging deep and getting all the pieces in place.
So it sounds like the architect in this pre-design phase is kind of like a conductor leading an orchestra, bringing in all these different experts and specialists.
That's a great analogy. It really captures the collaborative spirit of pre-design. Architects, with their broad understanding of the whole building process, often act as the prime consultant, but they're leading a whole team of specialists to cover all the bases.
So what are the architect's main responsibilities in this conductor role?
Well, they need to identify and bring in the right people. The subject matter experts who are the best fit for the project.
Right.
They also have to balance all the different recommendations coming from these experts. Often there are competing concerns, and the architect has to navigate that.
Yeah, makes sense.
They need to stay up to date on all these specialized fields to make sure they're making informed decisions. They're managing communication across the whole team to keep everyone on the same page. And they can even help the client secure funding by providing the necessary documentation. Basically, they're responsible for making sure the whole pre-design process is cohesive, consistent, and high quality.
So coordination and communication are absolutely key here.
Definitely. You can't just have a bunch of experts working in silos. Successful pre-design is all about collaboration. It's back and forth discussion and constant refinement. The architect needs to get the best outcome for the client while working effectively with everyone involved. And because the physical design doesn't exist yet and the solutions aren't always clear-cut, it's really important for the architect to advocate for enough time and resources for pre-design.
Right.
And not just for pre-design, but for all the design phases that come after it. Because you need that thorough collaboration and thoughtful decision-making throughout the process.
And our source material mentioned something interesting about how different people might understand certain terms differently, like the word program. Can you talk about that a bit more?
Oh, yeah. That's really important. Words like program can mean different things depending on who you're talking to. In architecture, as we've been discussing, it refers to that detailed document outlining all the functional and spatial needs the building has to meet.
Right.
But in project management, program could mean a whole group of projects that are coordinated to achieve a bigger organizational goal.
Oh, interesting.
So the architect has to make sure everyone is on the same page. They need to establish a shared understanding of what these key terms mean in the context of their specific project.
Yeah, everyone needs to be speaking the same language to avoid confusion. And I imagine architectural firms have to decide if they want to have all this pre-design expertise in-house or rely on external consultants.
Exactly. It's a strategic decision for each firm. Do they build up that deep pre-design expertise within their own team, or do they partner with specialists and bring them in as needed? Some architects even choose to specialize in pre-design services almost exclusively.
Wow.
But no matter what approach a firm takes, the key to success in pre-design is having the right team, clear roles and responsibilities, and a shared understanding that pre-design is vital to the whole project.
Okay, let's dig into some of these pre-design services in more detail, starting with business cases and feasibility studies. It sounds like these are all about figuring out if the project makes sense as an investment and if it's even possible to do.
You got it. A business case is like the project's resume. It's laying out all the reasons why this project is a good idea.
Okay.
It gives you the project background, explains the benefits that the project will bring, presents the different options that were considered, breaks down the costs, identifies the risk, and even looks at what might happen if you don't do the project at all.
So it's like a really thorough justification process before anyone commits any serious money.
Exactly. And the level of detail in a business case can vary a lot depending on the project. A lot of public sector organizations and big companies have multi-stage approval processes. And the business case is often the starting point for even more detailed analyses, like a feasibility study.
So how is a feasibility study different from a business case?
Well, the business case is really focused on the money, the financial reasons for doing the project, and the potential return on investment. A feasibility study takes a much broader view.
Okay.
It looks at the big economic picture, the regulatory environment, any potential political factors, the social impact, the practical aspects of how the project will work, and if it's even technically possible.
So it's really comprehensive.
It often includes the detailed functional program that we talked about before.
Hmm.
It looks at the specific regulations like building codes and zoning. It analyzes the potential sites, examines the environmental and social impacts on the community, and might even assess traffic and transportation. And the financial studies that are part of a feasibility study can be really detailed too. They might include strategic financial plans, preliminary cost estimates, market analysis, buy versus lease scenarios, revenue models, all sorts of things.
Sounds intense.
It can be. And with all the regulations these days, architects often have to prepare super detailed feasibility studies before a project can even get approved, especially for government projects.
Right.
These studies might even look at public-private partnerships or the project's impact on what's called the triple bottom line, which is its social, environmental, and financial sustainability.
A triple bottom line.
Yeah, it's becoming more and more important. And we're also seeing a growing focus on renewing and reusing existing buildings instead of just demolishing them and building new. Feasibility studies are key to figuring out if that's a viable option.
Okay, so feasibility studies are no joke.
Yeah.
Let's move on to budgeting, cost estimating, and financial planning. I know those are always hot topics on any project.
You bet. And it's really important to be clear about the difference between a client's budget and the architect's cost estimate.
Right.
The client usually comes in with an initial budget. That's their high-level commitment to how much they're willing to spend.
Okay.
But the cost estimate is the architect's professional prediction of what the project will actually cost to build. A big part of pre-design is comparing those two numbers and making sure they align.
So the budget is what the client wants to spend, and the cost estimate is what the architect thinks it will actually cost.
Exactly. And as the project gets more defined, the financial breakdowns get more detailed too.
Like how?
Well, you'll often see costs broken down into different categories. There's the cost of buying the land, the hard costs, which are the actual construction costs,
Okay.
the soft costs, which are things like professional fees, permits, that kind of thing. Then there's financing and carrying costs, and very importantly, a contingency fund for unexpected expenses. But the thing is, in pre-design, you don't have all the information yet. So those early cost estimates can be pretty rough.
Yeah, how rough are we talking?
Well, our source material mentions a potential variance of anywhere from -50% to plus 100% of the final cost.
Wow, that's a huge range.
It is, and that's why it's so important for the architect to be totally upfront with the client about how accurate these early numbers are. What assumptions are they based on? What are the potential limitations?
So good communication is essential.
Absolutely. And the architect also needs to be clear about the difference between the costs of construction and the total project costs. Because the total project costs might include things that are outside the architect's control.
Like what?
Things like furniture, fixtures, equipment, that kind of thing.
Okay.
Now, architects don't usually prepare the really detailed financial plans that look at market revenue and all of that. Those are called pro forma financial plans. But they can definitely give input on the construction costs and their own fees.
Right.
Ultimately, the financial plan helps define the scope of the project and leads to the client signing off on the budget at the end of pre-design.
Right, let's talk about functional programming now. This sounds like it's all about figuring out the nitty-gritty details of how the building will be used.
It's where we really dive into the client's needs and how the building will function on a day-to-day basis.
Okay.
We're asking questions like, what are the client's goals for this project? What's the overall scope? What kinds of spaces do they need? What does the site need to be like? How should different spaces and systems work together? How will the building adapt in the future? A good functional program is absolutely key to getting a design that really works for the client.
So it's about going way beyond just the square footage.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
The architect needs to really understand the client's operations, their goals, what's important to them. They need to figure out the cost, time, performance, and even aesthetic criteria that will determine if the design is successful.
And sometimes clients come in with their own program document, right?
That's right. But even then, it's super important for the architect to review it really carefully.
Yeah, why is that?
Well, there could be things that have been missed, inconsistencies, potential problems that need to be addressed. The architect's job is to make sure that program is solid.
Makes sense.
The goal of functional programming is to define everything the building needs to do to support the activities that will happen there and to make sure it operates efficiently. This means understanding how the new building will impact the people who use it, the community, and the local infrastructure.
And our outline mentions that functional programming can be a separate service.
Yeah, that's right. For smaller projects, programming might just be part of the early design phase, but for bigger, more complex projects, it often makes sense to treat it as a separate service.
Okay.
It really depends on the scale and the needs of the project. The final program document can be a simple spreadsheet or a really detailed report. The architect and the client have to work together to figure out the right level of detail.
Right.
And the process itself is very collaborative. You've got the client, other stakeholders, everyone working together to get that shared understanding of what the building needs to do. Architects use all sorts of methods to gather information. They might observe how things work now, document existing processes, analyze how people use the space, look at organizational charts, review staffing levels, figure out storage needs, apply those gross-up factors to account for circulation and mechanical space.
Gross-up factor?
Yeah, basically, it's a way to account for the space you need beyond the actual usable area.
Okay.
So, for example, you need space for hallways and mechanical rooms, even though people aren't actually working in those spaces.
Right.
And then there are external factors that can influence the program, too. Things like the site, the impact on the community, environmental and social considerations, the capacity of the existing infrastructure, any regulations, and the client's sustainability goals.
So all of this information then feeds into the actual design of the building.
Exactly. It lays the groundwork for everything that comes next. This analysis helps determine the approximate square footage for different functions, and it flags any technical considerations that the design needs to address, like special ring dimensions or durability requirements for materials or environmental controls, or even the types of hardware that will be needed.
Wow, it's really detailed.
It is. And the architect might even suggest different programmatic approaches to the client, like different building shapes or site layouts or ways to accommodate future growth or phasing strategies for construction.
Okay.
They might even talk about different operational models that the client could consider. And then the final functional program report usually includes a ton of information: the client's goals, the different stakeholders, the specific requirements for each space, those space relationship diagrams, which are often called bubble diagrams, the financial needs, the proposed schedule, the regulatory approvals process, the procurement method, the community and environmental concerns, even a recommendation for the best project delivery method. It's a really comprehensive document.
That's pretty impressive.
Yeah.
But I guess an architect who does the programming isn't guaranteed to get to design the building.
That's right. The programming phase is about defining the needs, not necessarily coming up with the design solutions.
Okay, so the next step would be space planning and optimization. Taking those needs from the program and figuring out the best way to fit them all into a building.
Exactly. Once you know what the building needs to do, the next step is to figure out how big it needs to be and how to arrange everything efficiently. This is where the architect's expertise really shines, because they can look at all the requirements and find ways to be smart about the space.
Right.
They can spot areas where there's too much space or redundancies that can be eliminated, or opportunities to share spaces or create multi-purpose rooms. That helps keep the building smaller, which saves money on construction and operating costs.
So it's all about making the most of the space.
Absolutely. Architects use their design knowledge and their understanding of building codes and best practices to figure out the optimal layout. They consider things like how many people will be in each space, what they'll be doing there, what kind of equipment will be needed, and how the structure and mechanical systems all fit together. And it's really important to understand the difference between net floor area and gross floor area.
Right.
Net floor area is the usable space. Gross floor area includes things like circulation walls, mechanical spaces. In commercial projects, they often use standardized measurements like the BOMA standards for office buildings.
Okay, interesting. And then there's business organization planning. That sounds like it's more about how the client operates internally. How does that relate to building design?
Well, sometimes the decision to build a new building or renovate an existing one can trigger a whole bunch of changes within the client's organization.
Oh, wait.
Yeah. They might need to rethink how they do things, how their departments are structured, how many staff they need, all sorts of things. In those cases, the architect might actually help with business organization planning.
So they're going beyond just the building itself.
Exactly. They might help with mapping out processes, figuring out how to deliver services more efficiently, restructuring the organization, analyzing staffing needs, and sometimes it works the other way around too.
How so?
The client might do some internal planning and realize that their existing building just doesn't work anymore, so that leads to a building project. And architects can also help with developing change management plans.
Change management plan.
Yeah, it's basically a way to help staff and customers adjust to big changes that are happening because of a new building or a renovation.
That makes sense. So the building and the organization are really interconnected.
Definitely. They can really influence each other. All right, let's talk about the early stages of a project now. Site evaluation and selection.
Okay, that seems like a pretty big deal.
Huge deal. This is where you figure out where the project is actually going to go. Site evaluation is all about assessing different potential sites and recommending the best one based on the program, the budget, and the schedule.
Okay.
Now, this is different from analyzing a site that the client already owns. That's usually a separate service, or it might be part of the early design phase.
Right.
Some clients already have land or have a few options in mind. Others are starting from scratch. So site evaluation is really tailored to what the client needs.
And I imagine you do those test fits during this phase, right?
Yep, exactly. You see if the program can actually fit on the site and function properly. But a good site evaluation goes beyond just looking at one property. It's about comparing different sites using the same criteria, looking at their physical characteristics, figuring out the regulations, and considering the highest and best use of each site.
What does highest and best use mean?
It means what's the most productive and valuable way to use a piece of land within the legal and practical limits. So you might not always go for the absolute maximum development possible, but you want to make sure you're using the site in a smart way.
Right.
Architects look at all sorts of physical characteristics when evaluating sites. The climate, the topography, the soil conditions, any environmental hazards, what's around the site, access to utilities and roads, legal issues like the property title and easements.
So it's a pretty thorough investigation.
Oh, yeah. And then there are all the land use regulations.
Yeah.
You have to figure out what's allowed on the site. What are the zoning rules? What are the limits on building height and size? Are there setbacks from property lines? What are the parking requirements? What about accessibility? Are there any design controls? And then there are things like environmental remediation, historical resources, floodplains, seismic zones, all sorts of things.
Oh, that's a lot to consider.
It is. And sometimes the client might want to do something that's not allowed under the current zoning. So the architect can help with applying for variances or even rezoning the property.
Yeah.
Rezoning can really increase the value of a site, but it takes time and effort. And architects can also help with preparing presentations and materials for development approvals.
So they're really involved in that whole process.
Yeah.
All right, let's talk about master planning and urban design. These seem like they operate on a much bigger scale than individual buildings.
Yeah, they do. Master planning is about creating a long-term vision for a specific site. It could be a university campus, a hospital complex, a big mixed-use development, that kind of thing.
Right.
It shows where future buildings might go, where the roads and utilities will go, how people will move around the site. Master plans often come after a functional program, and they might even be required by the city or town as part of the approval process.
Okay.
Urban design is a bit broader. It's about designing whole neighborhoods or even cities.
Wow, that's huge.
Yeah, it's big picture thinking. Urban designers focus on things like creating great public spaces, making places walkable and vibrant, connecting different parts of the city in a thoughtful way. It's less about specific regulations and more about the overall experience of the city.
So they're both about design, but at different scales.
Exactly. And architects are often involved in both master planning and urban design because they have that spatial design expertise. But it's important to remember that each project is different and the scope can vary a lot depending on what the authorities having jurisdiction require.
And just like buildings, public spaces need to be programmed too, right?
Definitely.
Yeah.
You have to think about how people will use those spaces, what activities will happen there, what amenities are needed. And these big plans can take years to implement, so you have to think long term.
Okay, now let's talk about building condition assessments. That seems like a really important service for people who own existing buildings.
Absolutely. Building owners need to understand what kind of shape their buildings are in so they can make smart decisions about maintenance, repairs, upgrades, and long-term investments.
Right.
Building condition assessments are usually done every few years, and they involve an architect or another building professional going through the building and checking everything out. They take photos, make notes, do sketches, and sometimes they use technology like drones to get a good look at the building. They might also look at any building records that the client has or bring in specialists to do more detailed inspections if they need to.
So it's a pretty thorough process.
It is. And then the architect analyzes all that information. They figure out how much life is left in the different building systems, how much it might cost to replace things. They prioritize any problems they find. They look for opportunities to bundle repairs together, and they help the client plan for future expenses.
Wow.
They often use a metric called the Facility Condition Index, or FCI, to get an overall sense of the building's condition. But it's important to remember that these assessments are a starting point. They need to be interpreted carefully to develop a real plan, especially for historic buildings or buildings with specialized systems.
Okay, now what about as-found drawings? I know those are important when you're working with an existing building,
Yeah.
but how are they different from other types of drawings?
That's a good question. There are a lot of terms that get thrown around, and it can be confusing. As-found drawings are specifically done during pre-design when you're planning to renovate or add on to an existing building.
Right.
They're all about accurately documenting what's already there. The dimensions, the layout of the walls and rooms, everything.
So you have a clear picture of what you're working with.
Exactly. But
Yeah.
they're not meant to be used for construction. They're just for the design phase. And they focus on what you can actually see.
Okay.
They don't try to guess about the structure or mechanical systems that are hidden behind walls or ceilings, but they might include notes about things that need further investigation, and photographs are really helpful to provide context.
And what happens when the client gives the architect their own drawings of the building?
Well, the architect still needs to review them carefully. They should go to the site and double-check some key dimensions, and they need to make sure those client drawings are kept separate from any new drawings that they create.
Okay, that makes sense. And what about coordinating all the data that the client provides? That seems like a pretty basic task, but still important.
It's absolutely essential. Clients often have a ton of information that's important for the project. Program requirements, budget numbers, schedules, site surveys, all sorts of things.
Right.
The architect's job is to gather all that information, to review it, and distribute it to everyone on the team. This kind of data coordination is considered a basic service during design and construction, but during pre-design, it's often a separate billable service because it takes a lot of focused effort to get everything organized in those early stages.
Okay, I see. Now, project management and project scheduling are crucial for any project. But how do they work in the pre-design phase?
Project management is a whole profession in itself, and architects should really get specific training before they offer full-blown project management services.
Okay.
The project architect manages the design aspects of the project, but there's often a separate project manager who oversees the bigger picture, especially on larger projects. And sometimes clients even hire their own independent project manager to represent their interests.
Right.
But managing the architect's own work, that's the project architect's responsibility all the way through design and construction.
Okay.
Now, when it comes to scheduling in pre-design, we're talking about creating a high-level plan for the whole project from concept to completion. It's usually presented in terms of weeks or quarters, and it might include key activities, resources, cash flow, critical path items, potential fast-tracking strategies.
Tracking strategies.
Yeah, ways to speed up the process if needed.
Okay.
But the main purpose of pre-design scheduling is to give everyone a rough idea of the timeline. It's not a super detailed schedule like the contractor will develop during construction.
Right.
And sometimes you even create different scheduling scenarios to show what might happen in the best case, the worst case, and the most likely scenario.
Interesting. Now, what about those AHJs, the authorities having jurisdiction? I know it's important to consult with them.
Oh, it's absolutely critical. The AHJs are the government and regulatory bodies that have the power to review and approve different parts of a project.
Okay.
At a minimum, you've got the local municipality who's in charge of land use and building codes.
Right.
But you might also have provincial or federal authorities involved, especially when it comes to things like the environment, historical preservation, specialized areas.
So you really need to do your homework.
For sure. The architect needs to figure out who all the relevant AHJs are and talk to them early on in the pre-design phase. Those early conversations are so valuable because they can tell you about specific specific regulations that might impact the project.
Yeah, that makes sense.
They can help you understand how the regulations might affect the schedule, the cost, the design, the construction methods, even how the building will operate in the long term.
Wow. And what about land use analysis and rezoning?
Land use analysis is a must-do for any project, whether the client already owns the land or not.
Okay.
In Canada, the provinces are in charge of land use, but they delegate a lot of that responsibility to the municipalities.
Right.
And the municipalities have zoning bylaws that laid out the rules for how land can be used. So the architect needs to go through those bylaws carefully and figure out what's allowed on the site.
Yeah.
What are the basic parameters for development?
Like what?
Things like what types of buildings are allowed, how tall they can be, how much of the lot can be covered, where the buildings can be located on the site.
Okay.
And it's always a good idea to talk to the city planners early on to make sure you understand everything correctly.
Right.
Now, sometimes the client wants to do something that's not allowed under the current zoning. That's when you might need to apply for a variance or even rezone the property.
What?
A variance is like a small exception to the rules. Rezoning is a bigger change, and it usually involves public consultations and approval from the city council.
So it's more complicated.
It can be, but if you get the rezoning, it can really increase the value of the land. But it does take time and effort, and that needs to be reflected in the architect's fees.
And what about building code and fire safety analysis? I imagine that's important to do early on.
Definitely. You don't want to get too far into the design process and then realize you've violated a bunch of codes.
Right. That would be a nightmare.
So even in pre-design, the architect will do a preliminary analysis of the building need and fire safety requirements. They'll figure out what type of occupancy the building will be, if there are any prohibited combinations of occupancies, how many people the building needs to accommodate, how the exits need to be arranged, what kind of fire separations are required, and what construction types are allowed.
So they're laying the groundwork for a code-compliant design.
Exactly. And by doing this analysis early on, they can avoid a lot of headaches and costly revisions later.
Makes sense. Now, presentations and project promotion, that's all about getting people excited about the project and getting the necessary approvals right.
That's right. You often need to present the project to a lot of different people. The client, of course, but also funding agencies, government officials, the public. And architects are really good at creating visually appealing presentations.
Right.
They use graphics renderings, animations, charts, diagrams, all sorts of things to communicate the vision for the project. And it's important to tailor the presentation to the audience. You don't want to overwhelm people with too much technical detail too early in the process.
Okay.
Showing examples of similar successful projects can be really helpful too. It gives people a better sense of what to expect.